Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Before we begin, we'd like to hold a land remembrance. Lewis and Clark College occupies space in the historic homelands of several Indigenous groups. We want to take a moment to name the Indigenous peoples who have been and continue to be connected to the land we reside in. This includes bands of Chinook-speaking people, including the many Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watalala, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and the Molalla people in the Willamette Valley. Today, their descendants are primarily members of the Grand Ronde and Siletz Confederated Tribes, with Chinook and other tribal relations at Warm Springs, Yakima, and the Chinook Nation. Multnomah County is unceded land, and in this sense remains occupied space. In addition to the federally recognized tribes located primarily in the state of Oregon and in the city of Portland, we acknowledge the presence of numerous unrecognized tribes and Indigenous groups whose stories also demand and deserve our attention. It is important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and recognize that we are here because of the sacrifices and deaths forced upon them. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, their deaths, and their descendants. If you're interested in further supporting the Chinook tribe, there are resources outside of the council chambers that look like this.
Once again, welcome and good evening, everyone. How is everyone doing tonight? My name is Damaris Medina, and I am a fourth-year psychology major and ethnic studies minor from Washington, D.C., and I am one of this year's co-chairs of this symposium. With immense pride, I welcome you to the second keynote event of the 21st Annual Ray Warren Symposium on Race and Ethnic Studies. As we reflect on a pivotal U.S. election year, ongoing global conflicts, and the everyday challenges posed by borders in our lives, we hope this symposium encourages us to explore various borders we encounter. We also aim to examine the impact of these borders on our experiences and their connections to concepts of race and ethnicity. This is why we have chosen our theme, On the Border. This symposium is an opportunity for meaningful dialogue, inspiration, and new perspectives on borders, examining not only geographic boundaries of nations and neighborhoods, but also metaphorical, symbolic, and personal borders. We invite participants to consider the multifaceted dimensions of borders. By looking at borders through various historical and cultural perspectives and a variety of mediums ranging from art, music, film, to personal narratives and academic research, we hope to offer a larger and broader discussion of what it means to live in a bordered world. Our hope is that we foster a sense of community together instead of contributing to more division.
Thank you, Damaris, and thank you everyone for joining us today as we celebrate 21 years of Ray Warren's legacy in the symposium created by students in his honor. My name is Sonali Blair. I'm a fourth-year sociology and anthropology student and Hispanic studies minor from Denver, Colorado, and I'm also a co-chair for this year's symposium on the border. Tonight, alongside Damaris, our other two co-chairs, Alicia and Maylin, and our amazing faculty director, Kim Brodkin, we are overjoyed to welcome Christina Leza to campus and for her keynote presentation, Indigenous Hip Hop and Healing Soul, Colonized Moderns in Conflict on the U.S. Mexico Border. Before this event begins, we have a few housekeeping announcements.
First, we encourage everyone to follow our social media handles listed on our website. Tonight's keynote presentation will also be recorded and shared on our website in the coming weeks. As you listen, we encourage you to jot down notes, ideas, or questions, as there will be a Q&A afterwards. We'll invite you to raise your hands and wait for one of us to come to you with the microphone. We may not get to everybody's question, but we'll get to as many as possible.
Following the Q&A, we'll have a reception in the lobby where you're invited to mingle with Dr. Leza and ask any questions to her that you didn't get to during the Q&A.
We would also like to bring to your attention our donation drive that has been taking place for the past week. We have partnered with the LC Center for Social Change and Community Involvement, the Immigrant and Refugee Community Organization, also known as IRCO, and Refugee Care Collective to create restart kits for immigrant and refugee families in Oregon, many of whom arrive in our community with few possessions. We're collecting new household items like toothbrushes and dish soap at various locations on campus, but there's also a box located outside of the council chambers. Check out the list for what you can donate on the donation box.
And if you can't donate, we'd love to see you on November 23rd, where we will be building these restart kits together. The event will take place at 10 a.m. and once all, hopefully 50 kits are made. If you can't make the whole time, we recommend that you come for the beginning of the event. It requires registration through a link that can be found in our link tree on social media, and you can also scan the QR code on the info sheet on the outside of this room.
We would also like to remind you that we have a full day of events happening tomorrow. The day will start off with a post-election roundtable with ethnic studies faculty discussing ways that concept, tools, and perspectives from ethnic studies can guide our thinking and action. This event will be followed by an Arabic folkloric dance performance and workshop with a group whose mission is to preserve Palestinian culture. And then after that, there will be a fashion show showcasing students' personal identities and narratives through style and fashion. And then lastly, race monologues will happen tomorrow night. So check out our website and social media for a complete schedule.
Now, we would like to draw the raffle winner for Dr. Leza's Divided Peoples, Policy, Activism, and Indigenous Identities on the U.S. Mexico Border. If you haven't already put your name on the ticket and put it in the envelope, please raise your hand so we can go and collect those now. And we kindly ask that you write your name on the back of the ticket, if possible. So if there's anybody that didn't. Lovely. Okay. We'll draw it. You want to do it on? Okay. Yeah. It's a lot in here. Just taking our time. All right. Okay. Oh gosh, I can't move it. The winner is Mila? Yes, there is. Prundo? Oh, Milo. Sorry. Oh.
How do you pronounce your name?
Milo. Okay, so yeah. Congratulations.
Okay. Tonight, Sonali and I are beyond thrilled to welcome Christina Leza to our campus and symposium. Dr. Leza is an associate professor of anthropology and indigenous studies at Colorado College. She is a Yoeme Chicano activist whose research focuses on indigenous rights and lifeways, grassroots activism, and social discourse about race and ethnicity. Much of her scholarship investigates the U.S. Mexico border region through the lenses of identity, policy, activism, and music.
As an activist, author, professor, editor, public speaker, and community leader, Dr. Leza has been invited to speak widely about her work at events hosted by various universities around the country, and her work has been featured in numerous scholarly journals and media outlets.
Her book, Divided Peoples, Policy, Activism, and Indigenous Identities in the U.S. Mexico Border, addresses what is typically less discussed in national discourses, the impact of current border policies on the indigenous peoples of this region. One reviewer described Divided Peoples as a powerful critique that shows, quote, how colonial and national geographic boundaries have affected indigenous autonomy and reconfigured alliances and politics, end quote. As readers, we are asked to look at the lived realities of Indigenous communities living at the borderlands and grassroots actions to forge new ways of belonging and cooperation. Another reviewer echoed this by noting, quote, "At this time, more than ever, an understanding of the crisis on the U.S. Mexico border needs to be understood from the perspectives of Indigenous peoples of this region," end quote. In her ethnography, Leza invites us to consider the layers of division created in this border region and how both social political movements and scholarly discourse can challenge settler colonialism.
Dr. Leza is currently writing a textbook about linguistics of racism titled The Language of Racism and Anti-Racism, and is lead editor of the forthcoming second edition of The Everyday Language of White Racism. Anti-racism and decolonialization are topics central to her teaching, and she's involved in anti-racist and DEI work at Colorado College. Dr. Leza is a member of the Board for the Citizens Project as well, a nonprofit organization focused on promoting equity and civic empowerment in the Pikes Peak region of Colorado. She advocates for her community both outside of and within academia. This is just who she is. Her work of advocacy for the human and cultural rights of Indigenous tribes at the U.S. Mexico border inspired all of us co-chairs.
Please join us in welcoming the fabulous Christina Leza.
All right, so now I just need to be as wonderful as they made me sound. It's gonna be a challenge. Thank you all for being here tonight. I'd also like to thank the wonderful student co-chairs for this symposium, Milan, Sonali, Alicia, Damaris, for the fantastic work that you've done with all of these marvelous events for the symposium. I've been told by the student co-chairs that Kim Brodkin, who I also need to thank for helping to bring me here today, I've been told that she is apparently the master of symposia. And so I feel very fortunate to benefit from all of the work that she's done to make this event happen. And of course, I'd like to extend a thanks to Ray Warren's family for allowing for this fantastic opportunity for us to be here over these few days to talk about all of the challenges there are to addressing racism in society, to feel a sense of solidarity with others who are critically concerned about the issues that we face today, and also an opportunity to celebrate together the ways in which we continue to survive and thrive as we work together to make a future that is truly post-racial. So I am also very honored to include or have my work included in this discussion. As was noted, I'll be talking today about the U.S. Mexico border, and in particular how the U.S. Mexico border impacts Indigenous peoples. And I'll be talking primarily about just one aspect of activism of the U.S. Mexico border, and that is an artistic form of activism by Indigenous hip hop artists. So what I'm going to be talking about today is based on fieldwork that I carried out on the U.S. Mexico border, primarily in southern Arizona and northern Sonora, in collaboration with a nonprofit grassroots Indigenous group by the name of Alianza Indígena Sin Fronteras, or Indigenous Alliance Without Borders. And this is a group that works to have the rights of Indigenous peoples who have been historically divided by the U.S. Mexico border better recognized both in the United States and Mexico, but also internationally. And the group is made up of individual members from the Pascuayaqui, Tona'atham, Cocopah, Kickapoo, Hopi, Navajo, and Cherokee nations. In the past, we've also had a lot and continue to have a lot of collaboration with members of the Lipan Apache Nation in Texas, and the Yaqui and O'odham, or we've had individual members from Yaqui and O'odham communities in Mexico as well. And we have also several members of the organization who identify as Mexica and Chicanx. And the particular musical groups that I'll be focusing on today are Shining Soul and Aslan Underground, and these are groups that I became familiar with through my work in the U.S. Mexico border region. So I'll start with Shining Soul. Shining Soul, when it first began its work as a group, it started as a duo made up of Tohono O'odham Nation member Alex Soto and Chicano identifying Franco Abre. And they continue to be they are no longer a group together, but they completed 3 albums together, and there's still some talk of maybe some future collaboration. But they were the frontmen for the group, the MCs, and then in their last album together, they were joined by Navajo Nation member Lawrence Martinez, who served as the group's DJ. He's known in his DJ work as DJ Reflection. So I'm going to start just by playing most of a video by Shining Soul from their album Sonic Smash. And this is to give you a sense of the sound of the group as well as the issues that they address in their music related to the U.S. Mexico border.
Like a native thing or a Mexican thing or whatever thing. It's people thing. Yeah. We just happen to be who we're from. Yeah. So that's why he's representing here, you know what I'm saying? So I'm going to represent back home too.
And what you and immigration reform. Let the man know if we are people.
We've seen enormous progress over the last month and a half.
But we don't love anybody who doesn't love us. We're non-violent with people who are non-violent with us.
I'm actually very optimistic that
but we are not non-violent with anyone.
Apologies, I just need to set
we'll see a bill ready to move through the process.
The Border Patrol has more agents than ever. Nearly
for some reason.
22,651 miles of fence, 125 airplanes, and 6 drones patrolling the Mexican frontier, making a successful illegal crossing more difficult than ever. In fact,
just because you pour syrup on shit don't make it pancakes, you know what I'm saying?
We from that, home of the season, house of the insurrection, what 1070 means 187, no love for brown complexion, silence is acquiescence, where non-violence protects and serves the 1%.
We from that land of the man in the maze, where criminalization, militarization got our fists raised. Put them up, take action now, we revolutionary but indigenous. RBI's continuing, my home until offenses.
This means war, so I'll see you on the front line. Shots for the one time, it's in my bloodline. Always a rebel, never settle for the setup. Keep your head up and your heart open.
Beyond the spectacle, racist tentacles. You know why?
You know
it's
why?
Bigger than Ohio. Borders patrol for economic control. If you wanna stop, Joe, recognize the fight is global.
You can bet that calling me wetback will get your head cracked. So I stay strapped with knowledge of self, full stealth, all black. I'll say it in all caps. It's the NOBORDERS. This struggle is not for the heartless. I reiterate, no borders. Zapachos got us living like sojourners. We landless, branded, scapegoated as scandalous. Fight back. Self-defense is a human right, despite what the liberals and the fascists say. The path has been laid, precinct to precinct, Gambito to the south side. Our communities have been militarized. Open your eyes. What we need is a military response, a hood renaissance with a heavy dose of upheaval. And it starts with one conversation. Power concedes nothing without confrontation. We from that ground zero, anti-heroes, saying that shit that you can't say, like smash borders, chinga la migra, middle finger to la línea. We from that desert borough, we keep it thorough, saying that shit that you can't say, like smash borders, chinga la migra, middle finger to la línea.
It's a no man's land, all quiet on the southern front, till the drones fly past, a reminder what is really up. What the fuck? It's war, time to spit our heart and guts in the face of law. Migra searching in my trunk, at the checkpoint stuck. Fuck the police is what I bump. Same pawns, cannot munch. Terrorizing like Ku Klux, got my people in flux. I can only take so much. We up against the wall, my homeland's been pushed between a rock and a hard place where opposites chase. My red and brown face, e-verify in my race. Like the West Bank and out the Palestinian was certain. Like the hurt and divided like East Germans. Speaking in first person, I am the native version of occupation, economic subversion. So I'm going insurgent, all out against borders, entrenched like a reporter, upholding my people's orders, no borders.
We from that ground zero, anti-heroes, saying that shit that you can't say, like smash borders, chinga la migra, middle finger to la línea. We from that desert borough, we keep it thorough, saying that shit that you can't say, like smash borders, chinga la migra, middle finger to la línea.
We choose direct to be who we are. We know the difference between the reality of freedom and the illusion of freedom. There's a way to live with Earth and a way not to live with Earth. We choose the way of Earth.
Rise up, y'all.
Okay, so I apologize I couldn't make the closed captioning work on that. There was a lot that was said in that video. But hopefully you could catch some of what was said as well as in the imagery, the ways in which the group is trying to address the violence that is occurring on the U.S. Mexico border against what they identify as brown and black people, so not only indigenous peoples but other brown peoples. And they also address the ways in which the very strict enforcement of borders are also impacting people globally as well. In that particular video and in the body of work produced by Shining Soul, there's also special attention to the impacts of U.S. Mexico border enforcement on the Tana'atham Nation. And you see in this map here of the Tana'atham Nation, the way in which the U.S. Mexico border cuts right across the reservation of the Tana'atham Nation. You see to the north of the border the various districts of the nation, and the nation as a whole on the U.S. side is it's fairly large. It's roughly the size of the state of Connecticut. Not pictured in this map are the communities in Mexico that are also traditionally Tana'atham communities. In those communities, you have roughly 2,000 members who are recognized by the federal government as being members of the Tana'atham Nation with rights as nation members. However, they do not hold U.S. citizenship. And the strict enforcement on that particular stretch of the border that cuts across the Tana'atham Nation has resulted in a massive amount of surveillance and presence of Border Patrol, so surveillance in the form of drones and spy towers and the presence of Border Patrol has definitely been recognized as an ongoing threat by members of the Tana'atham Nation. Although the nation has been put in a position to collaborate closely with the federal government for the enforcement of the border, nevertheless, there have been various incidents that have shown the ways in which Border Patrol presence is not in the best interest of the Tana'atham people. In May of 2023, tribal nation member Raymond Matia was killed by 3 Border Patrol agents. This happened as a result of Matia actually calling enforcement, both Border Patrol as well as State Patrol, in order to bring attention to the presence of migrants near his home. So he was actually working to try to collaborate. It seemed to be he was trying to help the migrants by making sure that they would be safe, but also collaborating with Border Patrol. But this resulted in Border Patrol coming to his home and ultimately killing him by firing dozens of shots at him at close range. And this is something that the Tana'atham Nation has definitely protested, as the Justice Department has decided not to pursue charges against the agents. And it's easy to miss, but in the video you just watched, there was a part of the protest movement that you saw there included the holding up of a banner that showed the name Bennett Patricio. This is a Tana'atham Nation teenager who was killed several years ago Mexico by a Border Patrol vehicle moving through the nation at high speed. When I began working in the U.S. Mexico border region with the Alianza Indígena and other grassroots groups who collaborate with the Alianza, I certainly heard a lot about the joint concerns for those who identify as Latinx as well as those who identify as Indigenous in terms of the ways in which the enforcement of the border was impacting the rights of all brown peoples in the region. And this was especially significant during the time of protest against two state bills that were being put forward in Arizona. One that would essentially legalize racial profiling against those who look Latinx and profile them as potential illegal immigrants. And then another bill which was working to remove ethnic studies programming from public schools in Arizona in a way that would severely impact all students of color, but most severely Latinx students and Indigenous students. But with slogans on protest signs such as "We didn't cross the border crossed us," which referred both to the ways in which those who had traditionally resided in the region prior to the establishment of the U.S. Mexico border, prior to portions of the Southwest becoming part of the United States, and also Indigenous peoples like the Tana Atham people also seeing the ways in which the border had been created and then severely impacted the nation in very negative ways. There seemed to be a unification of these different groups around shared struggles related to the border. However, I also saw, even through this unification, conflicts that were very much long-standing within the region. Since the period of the Chicano power movement in the 1960s, the notion of Aztlán has become an important symbol of Indigenous ancestry for Chicano people. But this is a concept, and for those of you who are not familiar with Aztlán, this basically refers to the mythic homeland of the Aztec people. And you can see from a mural image here by artist Emilio Aguayo that this is in the conceptualization within the Chicano power movement seen as encompassing the entire Southwest, essentially. But the reason this is problematic to many American Indian or Native American peoples in the United States with very distinct origin stories, ancestral stories, and connections to their own homelands within the U.S., there is a strong sense that this notion of Aztlán is part of a discourse of reconquering land that was taken from Chicano peoples, and doing so in a way that does not seem to recognize or respect the origin stories and territorial connections of land for other Indigenous peoples within the region. So Alex Soto, one of the MCs of Shining Soul, has stated that he absolutely understands that Aztlán is an important symbol, but nevertheless, it doesn't really see that as something that he can embrace because it isn't recognizing his own people's origin stories as well as the stories of other peoples in the region. And Franco Abre also, although he identifies as Chicano and has also had his own connections to the concept of Aztlán, also, again, thinks that this is too much a part of a colonial discourse, a way of trying to say that the lands were taken from the Aztec peoples and now they will be reclaimed in ways that very much erases the experiences of Indigenous peoples other than Chicano peoples. So in my work, I've looked at least two primary types of indigeneity within the U.S. Mexico border, which often work in competition with each other, but which I see as being really important to recognizing shared senses of identity in terms of indigeneity, but also recognizing the distinct experiences that are really important to recognize in order to respect the different ways of being Indigenous within the U.S. Mexico border region. And so these two primary primary ways of thinking about indigeneity within the region are Native American or American Indian indigeneity, meaning those who identify as indigenous and who belong to tribal nations that are typically recognized by the federal government, but may not necessarily be recognized by the federal government, but specifically nations in the United States and and Canada. And then there is the Mexica Chicanx detribalized indigeneity, and this is an indigenous identity that is held by those who no longer necessarily have a distinct tribal identity, and so may identify with Aztlán symbolically, but the reason why they may identify as Mexica, Chicanx, or detribalized is because of the violence of colonialism and the ways in which the roots, their indigenous roots, were severed from them as a result of those historical colonial processes. This, of course, simplifies a very complex situation in terms of identity on the U.S. Mexico border. There are, of course, people who identify both as Native American or American Indian and also Mexica or Chicanx. And then even within those two larger groupings, there are lots of other divisions, lots of diverse ways of identifying as an indigenous person. But what I speak to in my work is the ways in which it's still very difficult to work through a concept of what it means to be an indigenous person and to continue to define yourself as an indigenous person in relationship to other indigenous peoples with very, very different experiences from your own, because of the ways in which we all still continue to work under a colonial racial logic. And this, by this I mean a distorted colonial logic about race and peoples. And here, peoples are defined by their race, essentially. And then there's also this conceptualization that races must be maintained in a pure state. And of course, the notion of race is a fiction that was created by colonialism, by Western colonial nations, as a means of justifying why it is that they were taking resources from non-Western peoples of color around the globe, a way of saying that we all belong to these essentially different races within the broader humankind, and then saying that there are some groups that are superior to others and therefore must take control of other peoples. But this logic, even though it arose during the colonial period, you still see that it is maintained, or a way of maintaining settler colonial power, as the colonized access to ancestral resources is limited or lost through racial, or the ideas about racial contamination. So the exemplary example of this would be notions of blood quantum for identifying whether a person is a real indigenous person in the United States and in Canada, which would define whether or not they have rights as indigenous peoples within their nations and within their distinct tribal groupings, and to what extent they may have this ability to access those ancestral resources. The other band that I'll talk about is Aztlán Underground. And so this particular group, it primarily identifies as a Chicanx group. All the members of the band identify as Chicanx, but there's also mixed ancestry within this group. So there are also members who identify from indigenous groups, and this would include Apache, Comanche, and Massachusetts. And I'm just going to play a little bit of I would say it's the most famous song. It's how I learned about Aztlán Underground. People were always sort of singing the song. They played it a lot at indigenous gatherings. But I'm going to play a live performance just to give you a sense of sort of the energy that tends to develop around this song on the U.S. Mexico border among border activists and those who identify as Chicano. Yeah, I'm really sorry. For some reason, I'm not able
Everybody
to
in the house,
options.
if you're not afraid of love, loving yourself and loving the people and loving Mother Earth, we want you to put your fist in the air in the spirit of Zapatismo. We didn't cross the borders! Borders crossed us! We didn't cross the borders! The borders crossed us! We didn't cross the borders! Borders crossed us! Please, you guys can step back a little bit. DJ Metal Man's a little worried about his equipment. the oppression of the settlers when we cross the borders. We cross the borders. We cross the borders. Yes, the Senate nation lives in disgust. We cross the borders. We cross the borders. We cross the borders. Yes, the Senate nation lives in disgust.
And here, later in the song, are some lyrics that refer to the eagle and the condor. And this refers to a prophecy that seems to have originated with indigenous peoples in Peru, likely of Incan origin, to refer to a disastrous set of events that would severely and negatively impact human beings. And then a prophecy that would point to when it would be that humanity would be able to recover from this catastrophe. And within Latin American indigenous circles, the eagle and the condor have become symbolic of the two halves of indigenous being within the Americas. So the eagle is representative of Canadian and U.S. indigenous peoples, while the condor is representative of indigenous peoples within Latin America. And the idea behind the prophecy is that when indigenous peoples in the North and in the South can unite together, they would be able to find ways to help each other to heal and to heal the earth of the destruction that was wreaked by these catastrophic events. And in indigenous communities who refer to the prophecy of the eagle and the condor, it's very much colonialism and the after effects of colonialism that are seen as the catastrophic events, the world event that led to many other events that would ultimately destroy almost destroy various indigenous institutions, and something that indigenous peoples are still recovering from. And so you see in some of the lyrics that are highlighted here, lyrics that point to the ways in which historically indigenous peoples of the North and the South have been divided by this colonial mentality of who gets to count as what under this colonial racial logic, but really trying to communicate that we are in fact one people with different experiences of the world, but nevertheless part of the same family, and that we need to come together and unite to work against the shared threats that we now experience. So now I'm going to play just a bit of the song Lost Souls by Soul and Underground to give you a sense of the ways in which this band draws from apocalyptic imagery as a way of speaking to the ongoing violence that indigenous people still continue to face following colonialism.
Rowing is boring. And
I apologize, I forgot that YouTube now will not let you use your subscription to take out ads in third-party programs. So I'm gonna have to sometimes go outside and go to, here, I will try not to leave it on that particular image. Let me go ahead and move forward here. Let's see here.
These mushrooms make you feel...
Almost there, I promise you. Here, I'm going to try to, there we go, okay.
Lost soul, you're a lost soul, you're a lost soul. You don't know where to turn, you roam out of control because you're a lost soul, 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 you're a lost soul. You don't know where to turn, you roam out of control.
Backwards days, backwards ways, backwards days, backwards ways, backwards days, backward ways, backwards days, backwards ways. Wasichu's ways, the white man's ways, Wasichu's ways, flowing through my bloodstream. I got infected with the conqueror's knife, dreams clouding my mind and blinding my vision. They take out my brain with a western incision. Now they got me walking without a soul. Now they got me walking with no place to go.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. I'll go back to the presentation here. Oh, sorry, I need to move ahead. So what you hear in that particular video, or the track that is played through the video are various types of melodic and sound effects that point to what I see as a distorted soundscape that's being created by the band. So you hear distorted synthesizer lines and usually slow cadence throughout the song, stressed vocals, and there are also various sound effects that you hear later in the song, such as the sounds of crying babies. And the lyrics of the song also very specifically point to the ways in which a great deal of pain and violence that is being represented through the sounds of the song has been caused by colonial violence against indigenous peoples. And this is a colonial violence that indigenous peoples continue to grapple with. And yet ultimately, the band does see its music as being a form of healing, that part of the healing is to grapple with and to come to terms with the experience of colonial violence. But members of the band have spoken about music as being something like a prayer or an intention of consciousness. It creates a frequency in the world that has healing effects. And part of the healing notion you hear in the music is bringing forward a traditional indigenous ceremony through the music. So what you hear at the very beginning of that track that carries throughout the song, and you hear this throughout the albums that are produced by this particular group, is the ceremonial sounds of indigenous peoples in various parts of the Americas, but in particular in that song you heard the ceremonial sound of the gourd rattle that you'll often hear in mestizo traditional dance, as well as in the traditional ceremonial songs of other peoples of Mexico. Shining Soul also, in its work, establishes a certain symbolism related to recovery from extreme violence in their concept of soul shine. This refers to this concept of an elevated soul, a soul that has the opportunity and the ability to rise above oppression in order to really be able to show its beauty. And part of the showing of this beauty, an essential part of the showing of the beauty is in being able to be very truthful about who you are and accept yourself fully. But in Shining Soul's music, there is certainly a philosophy that is developed that points to the need for people who have been oppressed to support each other in their ability to let themselves shine. And so there is this message of being able to respect each other through differences and to ultimately love one another. And this definitely is something that the band members think about very critically in terms of their activism on the U.S. Mexico border, and thinking about the extent to which Latinx and indigenous peoples have been severely fragmented by racial identity politics, and the ways in which trying to support each other, trying to free each other from our varied but also shared oppressions is very difficult, again, because of the type of strict logics that are at work that continue to oppress indigenous peoples and keep them from being unified. So I'm going to play just a bit of a video here by Shining Soul called The Healing, and then I'll talk about that for a moment.
It's the H-E-A-L-I-N-G. It's the H-E-A-L-I-N-G. It's the H-E-A-L-I-N-G. It's the H-E-A-L-I-N-G. Sound familiar, don't it? We came to own it. Don't try to clone it. This is my defining moment. An act of atonement, composed of components, hex opponents, exponents, a power lies dormant, burning through the light, bittersweet the times, burning through these rhymes, bittersweet the grind, guilty by design, searching for divine inspiration. Just read the signs. It's all sign language. We've endured the anguish. They say that we ain't shit. shit, but really I'm ancient. That means I'm patient. That means I'm really making a statement. Success and failure are always at adjacent. Why you so complacent? And I think you really need to stop it. If you're prospecting solely on the profits, cause I don't think you're really ready for this project. We should be speaking on multiple themes and topics, like how you still see women as objects. You out of pocket, what happened to the symbiotic relationships? Why you think of, well, let's keep the beat hinge lit. Slow burn on the wick. Most say we making it, some still hating it. The truth shall acquit, and I must admit, I can't trust your version of real. Internal zeal keeps me pushing through the darkness. It's the healing. It's the healing.
Forward here. So in the healing, you certainly hear the symbolism of the shining soul at work here with the ways in which they sample and play on certain lyrics. So the concept of burning through the light and bittersweet the grind. And the grind very specifically in this particular song refers to the grind of social justice work and the difficulty of working through and elevating oneself in terms of that soul elevation with the very difficult task of doing social work and the ways in which so much works against one in trying to do the work of racial justice in society. In the video, you also see Liaison. I didn't, it's a bit farther in the video, so I didn't play all of that. But you also hear Liaison bringing forward some of the symbolism of light, but it's light in a different sense. And here he very specifically talks about himself as a lightning rod. And so this gets to this concept of one as a weapon. He also refers to himself as being like Rick Grimes when striking at hearts and minds. And for those of you who are fans of the zombie series, The Walking Dead, you know who Rick Grimes is. He's a hero of The Walking Dead. And here you kind of see some of that violent sort of post-apocalyptic imagery, that even though the band is really striving towards this idea of the soul shine and healing for people, ultimately bringing peace to people and the world, there's a recognition that the world is still very violent. And to try to transform hearts and minds is still a lot like trying to chop zombie heads off. It is work, and it is horrible work at times, and it does weigh on the soul, even though the goal ultimately, of course, is to elevate the soul. So I have been looking at, in relationship to what these hip-hop artists are doing, at the ways in which indigenous scholars have thought about the experience of colonialism as a form of apocalypticism. And so we have the indigenous fiction writer Rebecca Ruinhorse, who's recently said that we've already survived an apocalypse, that colonialism was an apocalypse for indigenous peoples. And then there's a psychologist and Anishinaabe scholar, Lawrence W. Gross, who's argued that indigenous peoples in the Americas are still experiencing post-apocalypse stress disorder. And this is building on other work that has been done by indigenous scholars, particularly looking at the psychological impacts of colonialism on indigenous peoples, in which historical trauma from colonialism has resulted in what Duran and his partner scholar, Duran, refer to as the soul wound, that indigenous peoples have experienced wounds to the soul that are ongoing and need to be healed, but it can only be healed by really understanding and critically examining and addressing the historical genocidal impacts or practices that have caused severe impacts on the psychology of indigenous Americans. And also, certainly, that we see continuing to impact their lives in the actual ways in which society is materially structured to continue to oppress indigenous peoples. So Franco Abre, and talking about the healing specifically, is definitely thinking about decolonization in this sort of framework. He said that he never used the word decolonize in his music before. He thinks that's a little bit too on point, maybe also just not in the sort of happy spirit, joyful spirit of hip-hop. But he said that this is really what he's talking about when he's talking about the healing, that when you talk about healing, you're talking about healing from decolonization, and that's something that all peoples that have been impacted, not just peoples of color, but all peoples around the world have been impacted by colonialism. And he says that the song is something that when you listen to it, it has a very dissonant sound. And this was something that wasn't really intentional, but really captured the mood that they were in when they were trying to deliver this very complex message of the real hard work of actually working through decolonization. So they were trying to address some problem in the song. They sped up the track a bit to try to deal with that problem. And what you have is sort of this dissonance between sort of this driving hard, the very kind of almost too fast beat of the song, and then the more relaxed, light, sort of wind-chimey effects of that soul shine symbolism that's happening in the music. But Abre states that this is part of it, that the healing is not just about the stuff that feels good, the stuff that looks good, but it's dealing with the things that are actually quite horrific. So as I'm wrapping up here, I do want to explain my subtitle, Colonized Moderns in Conflict on the U.S. Mexico Border. This is drawing from hip-hop scholar Alejandro Nava's work. Nava has referred to hip-hop artists, in particular socially conscious hip-hop artists, primarily looking at Latinx hip-hop artists and Black hip-hop artists as conflicted moderns. And he believes that these are modern individuals who are modern in the sense that they are a part of modernity, they're embracing modern technologies, but they're conflicted because they are using these contemporary technologies as a way of rejecting modern consumer culture. And you do certainly see that with indigenous hip-hop artists on the U.S. Mexico border, but I conceptualize hip-hop artists on the U.S. Mexico border, and really I think ultimately other conscious hip-hop artists of color, as being colonized moderns in conflict. And specifically with the bands that I've talked about today, I see them as being these colonized moderns in conflict specifically because they are fully recognizing their state as colonized peoples, recognizing the state of conflict that they exist in as a result of settler colonialism, and are using their position in modernity through the technologies that are available to them in order to talk about their colonized state and to work against their colonized state. Nava also talks about apocalypticism, that is hard to say, apocalypticism as well, in reference to the artists that he looks at, and thinking about this shift from the earlier soul sounds of the 60s and 70s to the hip-hop sounds of the 80s and onward. He says that when you get hip-hop developing, you begin to see a shift from these utopian visions that began to emerge for brown and Black people with the civil rights movement, but that as the civil rights movement began to lose its hope in the sense that in the 80s you begin to see that the result of the civil rights movement has been some gains, absolutely, but different forms of oppression, different ways in which Black Americans are being threatened within urban, underfunded, and over-policed environments. And so he talks about the ways in which these prophetic dreams of the earlier soul period and these ideas of social justice ultimately give way to what he refers to as the dark and chilling hieroglyphs of apocalypticism. And this is what I observe as well in the music of bands like Shining Soul and Aslan Underground. And I am thinking a lot about the connections between hip-hop artists across different racial identities in terms of the ways in which their messages talk to very specific experiences of dealing with colonialism, but ultimately speak to connections across these different historically oppressed and still oppressed groups today. So I'm just gonna play a bit of a song by conscious British hip-hop artist Little Sims, who I think is very strikingly drawing from this type of apocalyptic imagery.
Hey there, my web crafting.
This is another one. Okay, let me get out of here, and I'm just gonna try to.
Wizards, do you want to sell a product online, but you don't want to go through the hassle of investing a lot of time into it, or, God forbid, hire a developer? Well, in today's episode, I'll show you.
I don't know what happened. All right, so let's see here. Again, I'm just going to play just a bit of this. At least the closed captioning will work this time.
The mercenary don't fight the war for free. They fight the war for a currency, not unity, not peace. Bookkeepers with information that covers all of these details. Fake news won't prevail with me holding the keys. Land of the free, enslaved by the false pretense. They attack and we play defense. How do I make you see sense? Have all of your thoughts deep and test your beliefs. If the law ain't for us, who's policing the police? Who's increasing all their fees? Listening to their speeches. How many times did we march with no shoes on, no J's or Louboutin? Been beaten on, we've been chewed on, but it happened years ago, so we should just move on. You think that man don't know pain cause he got a suit on, cause he finally got a plate that he can now have food on? Telling me that luck isn't everybody's friend, but really you can't fathom that my tree now has fruit on. Don't get me irate in this climate, it's heating up and that plane now can't fly straight. I might up and migrate. Turbulence results in your mind racing, prone to dehydration. Running cause you want freedom, don't die chasing. This is post-apocalyptic. Where we stand, you wanna give us the Bible and have us give up the land. They will dangle the carrot when nothing is in your hand and tell you never to worry, it's all just part of the plan. Fuck what you got planned, your wishes are my command. These people are not your friends, I finally understand. They wanna divide you and close people in your set, cause when you're winning together, that's bigger than any check.
I frantically and accidentally closed my presentation, but I'll get that restarted here for you. Okay, so you see in that video the ways in which Little Sims is talking very specifically about the experiences for Black peoples under the Black diaspora following colonialism, and the ways in which Black peoples continue to suffer and to fight through various Black freedom movements. But there are aspects of that particular song that certainly speak to the experience of other colonized people globally. So I'm going to point just specifically to these lyrics here. This is post-apocalyptic where we stand. You want to give us the Bible and have us give up the land. Certainly speaks to, as well, the experience of indigenous peoples in the Americas, as well as other indigenous peoples globally who were forced to give up their territories, a wealth of ancestral cultural resources tied to those territories in exchange for this fiction of a superior white Christian God, which has had obviously very negative impacts on the survival of various indigenous groups around the world. Alex Soto, who is actually now the director of the La Briola American Indian Data Center at Arizona State University, recently did a review of indigenous hip-hop scholar Kyle Mays' work, Hip Hop Beats Indigenous Rhymes. And he really talks to the importance of thinking about hip-hop as this really important resource that has been given not only to Black Americans as a way of talking about the experience of oppression for Black Americans, but also to many other peoples of color around the world, and really trying to get people to think about the ways in which, even though we obviously are very different peoples with distinct historical experiences, that ultimately there is this common connection through the beat in terms of the ways in which the beat of hip hop can be found to connect to the various musical traditions of indigenous groups and the ancestors of other people of color. And also thinking about how it helps to unite us in the now in terms of thinking about the ways in which we struggled together. Both Alex Soto and Yat, who is the lead vocalist for Aslan Underground, has talked about, again, Black music as a gift to the world. And there may be some concerns, and this is a discourse that sometimes happens within hip-hop communities as well as people of color communities as they talk about the idea idea of appropriation, there may be a sense that perhaps hip hop is a Black art that has been appropriated by indigenous peoples of the Americas. But from the perspective of Yad and Alex, this is more of a sense of having a respect for the origins of hip hop while recognizing that there has to be an intention to its use. So if the intention is to make profit, then it's appropriation. But if the intention is to uplift not only your own people, but other people of color who also share the experience of oppression, then it's something that should be valued as a way of bringing together people and ultimately allowing various oppressed groups to help each other. And certainly this should be connected to the work of scholar Halifu Asumare, who in looking at global hip-hop and seeing the different forms that it's taken, she very much thinks about the ways in which hip-hop continues to talk about very distinct local forms of marginalities and helps people to express pains that they're experiencing and working through very specific struggles, but also speaks to the ways in which we can connect our marginalities, the ways in which we can point to these shared forms of suffering under colonialism so that we can ultimately fight together. And I'll just end with words by Shining Soul from that track, No Mercy, that you listened to a bit earlier, in their recognition that the fight is global, that the fight is local, absolutely, and we need to think about what it is that we need to work on together in order to address the struggles that are particular to our own local communities, but we also need to think about the ways in which our struggles connect to a much larger global system in which various groups around the world continue to experience the ongoing impacts of colonialism and racial capitalism. And these groups have definitely inspired me to want to continue this fight, and even though it's a large global fight that one would need to fight, I'm inspired by the works of these artists, and I hope you are as well. So anyway, that is all I have for tonight, and I'm very happy to take any questions that you have. Oh, I think I was instructed earlier that if people have their hands up, I should point to them, and then you can bring them a mic. Yeah.
Oh. If anyone has questions, please raise your hand and we'll come to you.
Hi there. I was wondering, especially in light of the recent shift of political parties in power right now, if you have done any work or thought about the separation of families at the border, and if Indigenous peoples have things to say about that, and what they have to say about that, and how involved they are. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. And I apologize because the speaker, it's hard for me to tell who's talking. So, okay, thank you. Great, so I'll adjust my answer to you. Yes, in my work, it's really actually very interesting because when I first started my work on the U.S. Mexico border, there was a lot of negative, and you still see some of this absolutely among Indigenous activists, in particular more elderly Indigenous activists. This was not uniform across the board, but there was a tendency for some elder American Indian activists that I worked with to have some disconnect from Indigenous peoples in Latin America, and not really, even though they may collaborate in some border rights type of work, they didn't really see that as being connected to their issues as Indigenous people. But when the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, moved into power, and you saw the breakup of families, and you saw the detentions that were happening on the border, there were a lot of particularly elderly indigenous activists, both in the U.S. Mexico border, but then also through the more national networks that I have access to through social media, now really beginning to think about the extent to which the migrants coming into the border are really indigenous. I think that was hard for lots of indigenous peoples in the U.S. to fully conceptualize. They understood maybe on some level that a lot of the migrants coming in identified as indigenous, but then when you started to hear reports of things like not being able to have the ability to properly interview detainees on the U.S. Mexico border because they didn't have anyone to translate their indigenous language, then it became clear that, oh, these are not just Spanish-speaking peoples. These are people who come from indigenous communities. These are people who have the same types of challenges that we have. And a lot of thoughts came back as well about the boarding school experience. So in particular with the breakup of families, seeing the ways in which children were being taken from their families and the ways in which children were being isolated and also having trouble communicating because they primarily spoke within their indigenous language. This helped to bring a sense of connection for many Indigenous Americans in the United States who had not previously, I think, had the appropriate context to understand the extent to which they had shared experiences with Indigenous peoples in Latin America. So I think there's much more of a sense of kinship now between many Indigenous Americans and Latin American migrants, because there's a greater recognition, at least for Indigenous Americans in the U.S. now, that in fact those migrants are largely Indigenous people, and they have a lot of the same struggles and are experiencing a lot of the same types of trauma, unfortunately, that Indigenous peoples have experienced historically in the United States. Yes.
Is this on? Yes, it is. I want to say. Yes. First of all, thank you so much for your incredible keynote and for expanding my playlist. I really appreciate everything that you've said. I think I have a bit of a two-part question that speaks to what you were just saying, because I noticed that both the bands, they rap in English. And I guess I was just wondering, like, who it is that they want, like whether they're listeners or their audience or activists, like who are they primarily trying to move by opting to rap in English? And another layer to that, I think, is I very much read this as like expanding the genre of protest song and protest music in some ways. But do the artists consider the sound that they're putting out and the music that they're putting out as protest song?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as far as the audiences that the hip hop artists want to reach, I think they want to reach whoever will listen to them. And the members of both these bands, they are from the United States, and so English is their primary language. But they are to different levels within the membership of these two bands, also fluent in Spanish. So you will hear some sprinkling of Spanish here or there. There are some tracks, especially in Soul and Underground, not so much in Shining Soul. I don't think they have any tracks that are purely in Spanish. But Soul and Underground, you will have some tracks that are purely in Spanish. So they're definitely trying to reach a bilingual audience, I think. But ultimately, English is their predominant language, and they're trying to reach the widest audience possible within the United States. And so I think that's why English, both of those reasons tend to be why English tends to be the dominant language that they choose for their music. And the other question, which is an interesting one, is about the extent to which these groups see their music as protest. I'm always referring to groups like Shining Soul and Soul and Underground as activist groups, and in some of my writing I talk about how that's a very tricky word, because I justify it by saying, you know, it's working for your communities and you're active in your community. You're doing something that maybe other members of your community cannot or will not do, but you're active, you're doing things in order to address some very specific social issues on behalf of your own communities, but the groups themselves are very ambiguous about that term. You know, they'll talk about, like, they definitely see themselves as being part of a lineage. So Shining Soul, for example, they will refer to the work of Nina Simone. That's like one of their heroes, and they saw her as a really important protest movement artist. And so they definitely see themselves as part of that lineage, but at the same time, their identities as Indigenous peoples make them a little bit uncomfortable with some of the wordage around activist movement. They say it's not exactly just being an activist the way that anyone would be an activist. We're fighting for the traditions of our communities. We're fighting for certain types of spiritual concerns in our communities that maybe would not necessarily be in sort of the classic type of protest movement that you have seen historically with other groups in the U.S. So I think they definitely see themselves as being connected to protest movement, but they also see themselves as being unique in the sense that they are doing special types of things on behalf of their particular communities.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know if I was supposed to speak. This is like more of like a personal question, also just based off of what I've read about like your other work, but also like having to do with your keynote, which was wonderful, by the way. Talking like about a previous question about like conceptualizing being Indigenous, and more about like how you said like more Native Americans inside the United States have a hard time conceptualizing maybe like, from my personal experience as a Mexican American, like Mexican Americans also being Indigenous, the question's more of how do communities kind of like on the opposite end cope with themselves being Indigenous whenever like our culture is so influenced by like Western colonialism, and a lot of our traditions are as well. Like, is there any imagination that points towards like the realization and coming to terms with the fact that like our own indigeneity? I think that's kind of like the question, if there's any like literature or any of your work on that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So there is some work that's been done on this. Trying to remember. There's a scholar by the name of Marie Garut. I think it's Marie, but Garut for sure. She has looked at this concept of the real Indian, and has talked about the ways in which you could be the realest Indian possible. Like you could be very phenotypically like what people expect in terms of being an Indigenous person. You could be a member of a tribal nation. You can have the card to show people, look, the federal government considers me to be a Native person, and still, because of the messaging that we receive of what constitutes a real Indian, still have doubts about your own indigeneity. Maybe you didn't grow up with the traditional language of your people, and so you do not have a sense that you're a real Indigenous person because you don't speak your people's language, or maybe you don't have other types of specific cultural knowledge. But this is something that all Native people deal with. There's another scholar, a psychologist and scholar, Joseph Gahn, who talks about the ways in which even different contexts, shifting contexts, will shift the ways in which people see themselves as being Indigenous. So you can be someone who, among other young people, who you're learning your language, your people's traditional language, you engage in lots of traditions, you're doing work for your community, you feel very confident about who you are as an Indigenous person, but then you go into a room with a bunch of elders who are making fun of you because you don't know something. Then suddenly you feel like you're not a real Indigenous person anymore. So there's definitely literature out there that points to the ways in which the types of messaging that we receive about what constitutes a particular type of Indigenous person is definitely impacting all Indigenous peoples, in terms even people who you would not necessarily see as ever having their indigeneity challenged still necessarily go through these struggles, even if it's not all the time, but maybe in very specific contexts may experience a sense of of insecurity when it comes to their indigeneity. And I also have these struggles as well. I am of Yoame ancestry, but I didn't grow up in a Yoame community. I am not a tribal nation member. And the extent to which I'm considered indigenous shifts all the time in terms of, I feel very strongly I'm a Yoame person. I see that as an ancestral right that I have to claim my own ancestry and to learn about my people's history and culture to the fullest extent possible. But there are some rooms that I could walk into where that's challenged, that because I'm not a member of the Pascua-Yaqui Nation, for example, or because I didn't grow up in a specific community, that maybe I should not claim that particular identity. And I think that's just a struggle that people need to work through, both collectively in terms of their own communities and sort of the self-definition of their communities, but also individually. And the racial, what I refer to as those colonial racial logics, they definitely make it very, very difficult for us to be able to come to terms with our own indigeneity. So I think that is an ongoing struggle that people face under the current system that we exist under.
I noticed that there was some American Sign Language. How do things like American Sign Language or like other parts of like being part of like a disabled community connect to the indigenous peoples along the U.S. Mexico border?
Oh, that's a very good question. So I haven't seen specifically a way of creating unities that is related to the ASL community or the non-hearing community to border movement specifically. But I do know from talking to Shining Soul about the making of that particular video that that's just a part of a movement that they have to try to connect to all of the different communities that they see as sharing struggle within their own communities. And so I think that specific person that they brought in for the video, my memory is that is someone who is connected to them through social justice movement, and they just had the idea like, hey, can I speak through this video as a part of what you're trying to talk about in terms of the healing. And so I think that's just sort of what you see in that video is just sort of an outcome of the sort of general movement of that group to try to connect to the struggles of as many marginalized peoples as possible and help to give voice to all of the things that all of these different groups would like to say, but maybe don't always have the platform to say because of the ways in which their voices tend to be marginalized in society. Oh, yes.
Hey, thank you again for that amazing talk. I guess my question is about what you ended on and how global these issues are in relation to at least my sense of like hip hop being a more like American kind of concept. Do you see either that genre becoming more broad in the global scale of this, or do you think that there's something to like the localness of hip hop or like the localness of different music genres that could become kind of analogous to this kind of resistance, I guess, in other countries in a similar way, I guess?
Yeah, I think that hip hop has had a really significant cultural impact globally. And I think that's just because of the popularity of that particular musical genre in the United States initially, and because of the sort of global cultural power that the United States has and the ways in which we produce media and then have the ability to spread that across the world. Hip hop, I think, really very quickly caught on in a lot of different communities around the world. And again, what was being communicated through hip hop in terms of the very particular struggles of Black Americans in the U.S., I think that those messages of struggle really resonated with lots of other oppressed communities globally. But you also see this with other genres such as punk music. And so Soul and Underground, they definitely identify as a hip hop group, but they're highly influenced by the punk movement. And you see that a lot of their influences have also been influential on other groups globally in other parts of the world in terms of what punk communicates as far as social resistance and being actively voicing resistance to lots of dominant messaging about how people should carry on in society. So I think punk also has had a really significant impact and has that potential as well to really develop in the way that hip hop has developed.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I think that was our last question for the night. Thank you all for coming to our second keynote. Please join us in thanking Christina Leza again.